Morning. I will be speaking very briefly about President Roosevelt's role in the Doolittle Raid, which is indeed pivotal. We learned all about the raid itself from this extraordinary group of men who spoke to us last night. It was a privilege and it was a thrill hearing those fellows talk. It's like being in the presence of living, talking history books. I was very much moved by it. President Roosevelt's desire to see Japan attacked from the air goes well back. He had a deep, sentimental attachment to China. His family, the Delanos, had made their fortune in China, a good deal of it through the opium trade. His mother, beloved mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, was essentially raised in China. So he felt these very strong ties to that country. He became outraged by the behavior of the Japanese in their war against the Chinese, which had begun in 1937, their bombing of civilian population centers, their machine gunning of helpless civilians on the ground. When Lend-Lease was passed in March of 1941, along with Great Britain, the president brought in China as a recipient of military aid. In 1940, even earlier, he had asked if there wasn't some way that we could allow China to strike back. The idea under consideration was that the United States would give some significant number of bombers to the Chinese, who would then bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities. He was informed by General Hap Arnold that this was impractical, that these pilots could not be trained in any reasonable time to do this. Roosevelt then said, well, we'll give them the planes and we'll give them the pilots. American pilots will fly these bombing missions. And Secretary of War Stimson and others reminded the president that at that point we were not at war with Japan, and this might be considered as a hostile act. So the program was scaled back. And in the end, what we did was allow American pilots to volunteer to fight for China, gave them fighter aircraft, and that is the origin of the World War II legend, the Flying Tigers. Now Pearl Harbor occurs, a disaster. We lose Wake Island. We lose Guam. There's imminent defeat in the Philippines. Roosevelt now starts badgering the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He brings in George Marshall, Admiral Ernie King, Hap Arnold. Why can't we strike Japan by air from fields in China, fields in Russia, fields in the Aleutians? He badgers them again and again, keeps pounding at them. And he said, I want you to use some imagination in how we do this. Roosevelt was a sailor all his life, loved the sea, favored the Navy, and wanted to know if it were not possible to launch an attack seaborne against Japan. Ernie King, the chief of the Navy, goes back to his people, and as was explained in the speeches last night, one of his officers by the name of Lowe comes up with the idea of flying bombers off of a carrier deck. Ernie King then does something that is very difficult for him. He can't do this without the Air Force. He treats Hap Arnold as a stepchild on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. To King, the Chiefs of Staff were the Army and Navy, not this newcomer, this upstart Chief of the Air Force, Hap Arnold. But they are under this pressure from the president. And so they arrive at a plan of using a carrier as a floating air base to strike at the Japanese cities. This becomes designated as Special Aviation Project number 1. King goes back to the president and announces that they're going to hazard this very bold mission. And Roosevelt reacts with his favorite adjective. He said, "That is grand." Who's to run this mission? Who's to head Special Aviation Project 1? Hap Arnold picks a man who had come into his orbit many, many years before. Back in the 20s, Arnold had been advised by his executive officer that there was a flyer against whom he might have to take some disciplinary action. It seems that there were 2 young pilots sitting alongside a runway. A third was in his single-engine aircraft preparing to take off. And one of these fellows that's watching says to the other, "Watch me hitch a ride on that plane. Bet me $5 that I can't do it." They agree, and this pilot runs out onto the strip, and he plants himself on the axle between the 2 planes, unknown to the pilot of the plane. He takes off and looks over the side and sees somebody waving at him. He brings the plane down immediately with a very gentle 3-point landing. And the pilot jumps off the axle and goes up to his friend and says, "You owe me a $5." That is Jimmy Doolittle. So we have here an interesting combination of an aerial daredevil and an aerial engineer, student of aeronautics, who has ultimately earned a degree in aviation engineering from MIT, who will lead the raid. We've been told a great deal about that extraordinary, bold event. Now, we first learn that the raid has taken place through Japanese news media. They announce what has happened, and they claim that the only targets that were struck were hospitals and schools. Indeed, in all frankness, the damage that was inflicted, as the flyers last night made clear, was physically inconsequential. But what was far more important was the moral force of this mission. The Japanese military were pledged to keep inviolate the Japanese homeland, particularly the capital, Tokyo, and above all, the seat of the empire of Emperor Hirohito. The speakers last night, one of whom explained how his aircraft had flown 50 feet over the imperial palace, hardly inviolate. Indeed, Japanese airspace had been violated very clearly, and it is an enormous psychological boost. Now, President Roosevelt remains quiet for a while. He's badgered by reporters. How did this come about? Where were those planes flying from that conducted the raid over Tokyo? He plays it coy in the Roosevelt fashion. Finally, the question is put to him at a press conference, and recalling the recent bestseller by James Hilton, Lost Horizon, he said, "They came from Shangri-La." The effect of this raid, it is to allow Franklin Roosevelt to say, "We are striking back," a very forceful feeling. And I can tell you, as a kid who was witness to that era, that sentiment, "we are striking back," struck all of us very forcibly in that period. It was something of a turning point. After a string of defeats, the recognition that this enemy could be defeated. Thank you.